officials in the Trump administration, most notably Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary who has tied himself up in knots, but also figures like John Cole, the deputy Ukraine envoy, it is absolutely entirely unclear whether Trump has already conceded the issues of Ukraine's NATO membership being open and the possibility of the US putting troops on the ground, and indeed if the Europeans were asked to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, whether they would be subject to any kind of US security guarantees or given any military support by the US.
Let's speak to the Times correspondent Oliver Moody, who's in Munich. Morning, Oliver.
Good morning.
Give us a sense, if you can, of is the dust settling? I just remember all of the images yesterday of the leaders, European leaders in that room listening to that speech and the sense of shock. And I'm just wondering if that has subsided yet.
I think the dust is still very much swirling, and there is a very broad spectrum of opinion on how to interpret what Vance said. That ranges from deranged trolling at one end of the spectrum through Kaja Kallas's interpretation you mentioned earlier, that this is a kind of symbolic declaration of a rupture in the transatlantic alliance, all the way through to the idea that this is a radical new American foreign policy doctrine that Vance has announced here, namely the systematic subversion of liberal democratic institutions in Europe.
And depending on which version you think is the truth, how are European leaders thinking they need to respond?
Well, you can split the response into two levels. The rhetorical level is one where the states that are particularly dependent on American security guarantees for their safety, particularly the frontline states on NATO's eastern flank, are being extremely circumspect and diplomatic. And others, most notably the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, have issued an extremely spirited defense of Europe's mainstream democracy. But then on the strategic level, it doesn't essentially change the reality of this new relationship with America, which is that the Europeans have realized very clearly that they are going to have to spend enormously more money on defense and come up with some kind of command and political structures that can hold a kind of European defence union together.
If you cut through some of what J.D. Vance was talking about and the examples and the criticism, the core of what he was saying, that actually it's not the US's job to protect Europe anymore and Europe needs to step up and do it themselves. A lot of people would say, well, actually, that's probably not that unreasonable. And I'm just wondering if that is starting to be accepted within those circles in Europe, that yes, it's going to be difficult to raise that money, but actually it's maybe not that unreasonable a request.
I mean, this has been the case for 2 or 3 years at a minimum. I've been going to this conference for several years now, and every time we've discussed essentially these same questions and people have trotted out the same platitudes. And in a way, you can go back to the first Trump administration as the point where that realization settled in. What has changed is the sense of urgency and the desperate need to actually translate those cliches into meaningful policy and above all into gigantic extra public borrowing. But I would dispute that that was the core of Vance's message to the Europeans. I think it was very much that he's arguing that we are destroying our own democracies from within. And these analogies he was drawing with the Cold War put me very much in mind of almost the spirit of anti-communism of the 1950s.
I was interested to read yesterday some suggestions from US commentators that Vance's speech was very much really aimed at the domestic US audience, and he was trying to reassure people there rather than making a point to European leaders. Do you buy into that?
I think that is a very reasonable interpretation, given that he knows that this speech is going to get clipped and shared all over social media, even if people in Wisconsin are not necessarily watching the whole thing live. But it's also important to bear in mind how this speech has been received within Europe, and in particular by the parties of the hard right that the Trump administration is now supporting very enthusiastically. And the most obvious case of those is the Alternative for Germany party, which has been very, very strongly endorsed by Elon Musk. And Vance pretty much directly told the German establishment that they're going to have to strike deals with the AfD and get it into government.
And in fact, he met them, didn't he, yesterday on the sidelines?
He met Alice Weidel, who is the AfD's joint leader and candidate for the chancellorship, but he did not meet Olaf Scholz, who is the actual chancellor.
Gosh. Are we any clearer on the US plan for Ukraine? Because, of course, that's what everyone was expecting JD Vance to stand up and talk about.
We are, if anything, less clear than before, because if you put all of the various statements that have come from officials in the Trump administration, most notably Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, who has tied himself up in knots, but also figures like John Cole, the deputy Ukraine envoy, it is absolutely entirely unclear whether Trump has already conceded the issues of Ukraine's NATO membership being open and the possibility of the US putting troops on the ground, and indeed if the Europeans were asked to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, whether they would be subject to any kind of US security guarantees or given any military support by the US.
We know, of course, that Zelensky and JD Vance had a meeting yesterday. President Zelensky is addressing the Munich Security Conference today. It was interesting, Callum and I were talking before we came on air, and there was a sense that despite what is being said in public, Zelensky did seem in some ways a bit more reassured after his meeting with JD Vance. Would you think that is fair?
I think it's very, very difficult to pass the public statements. Zelensky is in a extremely difficult position where he cannot afford to publicly antagonize the Americans because they hold his country's destiny in his hands, and therefore I would be quite careful about interpreting what he said yesterday. We'll see today how he sets out his ideas in more detail.
Do you get the sense that there is, with you being there and witnessing everything that is being said and the conversations on the sidelines, that there is a coherent message coming from the Trump administration? Or do you get the sense that everybody is coming there kind of shooting from the hip, saying what they like, and in some ways just creating a sense of chaos is probably too strong a word, but unsettling people, making European leaders think differently, which is, we know, often what Trump likes to do? In one sense, the message from the Americans has been extremely cogent, and that is that the old transatlantic arrangement is over, and the Europeans cannot count on the US to come to their defense anymore, which is an absolutely seismic rearrangement of the Western order, the biggest geopolitical shift that Europe has experienced, certainly since 1989, possibly since the 1940s. But in terms of the actual fine detail, there has been, as you said, an enormous amount of chaos. And what is not yet clear is whether that is because there is no centralized plan in Washington and everyone is kind of taking the initiative and trying to seize control for their particular agenda, or if this is actually part of a deliberate strategy to sow confusion and put the Europeans off balance. Oliver, thank you so much for talking to us. It's really good to get your analysis, you being there. It's really useful this morning. That is the Times correspondent Oliver Moody, who is in Munich.